In the deep swamps of the American South, long before the Civil War, plantation owners whispered about a shadow that moved through the trees at night. Some said it was a spirit. Others believed it was a beast sent by the forest itself. But the enslaved people told a different story. They spoke of a young boy who vanished into the wilderness after a brutal punishment and returned months later with something impossible beside him, a black panther that obeyed only his voice. What followed became one of the most chilling legends whispered across plantations, a story of fear, resistance, and a mysterious force that slave masters could never control. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. In the early decades of the 19th century, when the American South was a land divided sharply between wealth and suffering, there existed a plantation hidden deep within the humid lowlands of Louisiana, where the air itself seemed heavy with silence. The plantation was surrounded by miles of swamp, dark forest, and winding river that twisted through the land like secrets that no one dared speak aloud. During the day, the fields stretched endlessly beneath the scorching sun as rows of enslaved men, women, and children labored from sunrise until darkness swallowed the horizon. To the plantation owner and his overseers, the land represented profit and power. But to those forced to work it, the place felt like a prison with invisible walls formed by fear, punishment, and isolation. Among the many enslaved children who lived on that plantation was a quiet boy named Kofi, a child whose life had already been shaped by hardship long before he was old enough to understand the world around him. Kofi had arrived on the plantation years earlier after being sold with a group of other enslaved people transported from another region. No one knew exactly how old he was, because records for children like him were rarely kept with care. What people did notice, however, was the way he watched everything. While many of the other children tried to survive by keeping their heads down and avoiding attention, Kofi seemed to carry a different kind of awareness. His eyes moved constantly, studying the land, the people, and the rhythm of life around him. He noticed the way the overseers rode their horses along certain paths at predictable hours. He paid attention to the sounds coming from the forest beyond the fields, and at night, when most of the plantation fell into uneasy sleep, Kofi often remained awake listening to the strange noises that drifted through the swamp like distant echoes from another world. The forest surrounding the plantation had a reputation that kept most people away from its shadows. Overseers warned that it was full of dangerous animals, poisonous insects, and swamps deep enough to swallow a person without a trace. Slave catchers often claimed that anyone who ran into those woods would quickly die from hunger, disease, or predators. Yet the enslaved workers whispered a different story among themselves when the overseers were gone. They believed the forest was not simply dangerous. They believed it was alive, ancient, and protective in ways outsiders could not understand. Old men sometimes told stories about spirits that guarded the wilderness and creatures that moved silently through the trees, watching the world of humans from the darkness. For Kofi, those stories did not feel like myths. They felt like possibilities. Every evening, after the long hours of field labor ended and the workers slowly returned to the slave quarters, Kofi found small reasons to linger near the edge of the forest. Sometimes he pretended to gather firewood. Other times he volunteered to carry tools back to storage sheds located near the tree line. The overseers rarely noticed him because he was small and quiet, the kind of child who blended into the background of plantation life. But Kofi was always listening, always observing, always feeling drawn toward the thick wall of trees that separated the plantation from the unknown world beyond it. The forest looked different from up close than it did from the open fields. During the day, sunlight filtered through the branches in narrow beams that barely reached the ground. Moss hung from ancient trees like ghostly curtains, and the air smelled of damp soil and hidden water. The deeper one looked into the forest, the darker it seemed to become, as though the land itself guarded its secrets carefully. For weeks, Kofi simply stood at the edge and watched. Birds moved through the branches, small animals darted through the undergrowth. But every now and then he felt something else watching him in return. It was not a sound he could clearly identify, nor a movement he could easily explain. It was more like a presence, an awareness lingering just beyond sight. At first, he thought it might be his imagination, a trick of the mind created by the stories he had heard. Yet the feeling returned again and again. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the trees and the plantation fields glowed with the fading light of dusk, Kofi stepped a little closer to the forest than he ever had before. The sounds of the plantation faded behind him. No overseer shouted his name. No one called him back. For the first time, the silence felt complete. Then he heard it, a faint rustle in the leaves. Slowly, Kofi turned his head toward the sound. At first, he saw nothing but shadows stretching across the forest floor, but then two small points of light appeared in the darkness between the trees. They were not reflections from the sun. They were eyes. Bright, unblinking eyes staring directly at him. Every instinct told him to run, yet something inside him refused to move. The eyes remained perfectly still, studying him with a calm intensity that felt both terrifying and strangely peaceful. Moments passed in silence as boy and creature observed each other. Across the narrow boundary between plantation land and wilderness, eventually the creature stepped forward just enough for its shape to become visible in the fading light. It was a black panther, larger than any animal Kofi had ever seen in his life. Its body moved with silent grace, muscles shifting beneath dark fur that seemed to swallow the last traces of daylight. The animal's tail flicked slowly as it watched the boy. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Kofi did not scream. He did not run. Instead, he stood perfectly still, feeling a strange sense of recognition he could not explain. The panther studied him for another long moment before turning its head slightly, as if listening to a sound deeper in the forest. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, the animal stepped backward into the shadows and vanished among the trees. The forest returned to stillness, leaving Kofi alone with the fading light of evening and the echo of something extraordinary that had just occurred. That night, as the enslaved workers gathered in the small cabins that served as their homes, Kofi said nothing about what he had seen. Yet the image of the panther remained in his mind long after the others had fallen asleep. For the first time in his life, he felt as though the vast wilderness surrounding the plantation was not simply a place of danger, but a place that might hold answers, freedom, or something far greater than the world he had always known. And without realizing it, the quiet encounter between a lonely boy and a silent predator had already begun to change the course of a story that would one day spread across plantations, forests, and swamps as one of the most mysterious legends ever whispered in the shadows of American history. Night after Kofi first saw the glowing eyes in the forest, sleep refused to come easily. The small wooden cabin where the enslaved children slept was crowded and warm, filled with the soft breathing of exhausted bodies and the distant sounds of insects humming outside in the humid Louisiana night. Yet Kofi lay awake on his thin blanket, staring into the darkness above him. As the image of the Black Panther returned again and again to his mind, it had not felt like an ordinary encounter. There had been no sudden movement, no roar, no attack. The animal had simply watched him with a calm intensity that made it seem almost aware in a way he had never seen in a creature before. Most people on the plantation spoke about predators as mindless dangers that attacked without warning, but what Kofi had experienced felt different. It felt as though the panther had studied him, measured him, and then made a decision. That thought lingered in his mind through the night, stirring a mixture of fear and curiosity that he could not easily ignore. When morning came, the routine of plantation life returned immediately. The sun rose slowly through the mist rising from the swamp, casting pale light across the fields where enslaved workers were already gathering. Overseers on horseback moved along the rows, their voices sharp and impatient as they shouted instructions and warnings. The day would be long, just like every other day before it. Kofi joined a line of workers heading toward the fields, carrying tools that felt heavy in his small hands. The rhythm of labor soon took over, bending, lifting, pulling, and moving through endless rows beneath the growing heat of the sun. But even as his body worked, his thoughts remained fixed on the forest and the silent animal he had seen the evening before. Throughout the day, he found his eyes drifting toward the distant tree line again and again. The forest stood quiet and unmoving in the distance, its dark edge forming a sharp boundary between the ordered rows of crops and the wild world beyond. To the overseers, that boundary represented danger and disorder, something to be feared and avoided. But to Kofi, it had begun to feel like an invitation. The moment he finished his assigned tasks that evening, Kofi once again found a small excuse to wander toward the edge of the plantation. He gathered fallen branches for firewood, moving slowly and carefully, so no one would question how long he remained near the trees. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the ground. The forest looked just as it had the day before, quiet, mysterious, and full of hidden life. For a long time, nothing happened. Kofi stood near the same place where he had seen the panther before, listening to the distant sounds of birds settling into their nests and insects beginning their nightly chorus. A warm breeze moved through the trees, carrying the smell of damp earth and leaves. Just when he began to think the animal would not return, he heard the same soft rustling in the undergrowth. His heart began to beat faster. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head toward the sound. The panther appeared once again, stepping silently between the trees as if it had been there the entire time. The creature, its movements were fluid and controlled, each step placed with quiet precision. Its eyes reflected the fading light of the evening, glowing faintly in the gathering darkness. This time, the panther did not remain as far away. It stopped several yards from Kofi and sat down calmly, its long tail curling slightly around its paws. For a moment, neither moved. The boy and the animal simply watched one another, connected by a strange silence that seemed to stretch beyond ordinary understanding. Kofi felt fear, of course. Anyone standing face to face with a predator that powerful would feel it. Yet the fear did not overwhelm him the way he might have expected. Instead, it mixed with a deep sense of curiosity and something else he could not quite name. Carefully, he reached into the small cloth bag he carried for collecting wood. Earlier that day, he had quietly saved a small piece of dried meat from the kitchen area, unsure why he had felt the need to keep it. Now he slowly placed it on the ground a few steps in front of him. The panther's eyes followed the movement, but it did not immediately approach. It simply watched, as though considering the strange offering. Kofi stepped back slightly, giving the animal space. Minutes passed before the panther finally rose from its seated position and moved forward. Its body remained low to the ground, cautious but not aggressive. When it reached the piece of meat, it lowered its head and sniffed it briefly before eating it in a single quick bite. Then it lifted its head again and looked directly at Kofi. Something had changed in that moment. The invisible line of distance between them seemed slightly thinner. The panther did not retreat into the forest immediately this time. Instead, it remained there, studying him quietly, before eventually turning and disappearing into the darkness among the trees. That brief encounter marked the beginning of a pattern that would continue for many days afterward. Each evening, Kofi returned to the same place near the forest's edge whenever he could find a reason to do so. Each evening, the panther appeared. Sometimes it arrived early, watching him from a branch above or from the shadows beneath thick roots. Other times it seemed to appear suddenly, as though it had materialized out of the forest itself. At first, the distance between them remained large, but little by little, that distance began to shrink. Kofi always brought small pieces of food scraps he managed to save quietly from the kitchen or the fields. The panther accepted them cautiously, never rushing, never showing signs of aggression. Over time, it became clear that the animal recognized him. Its behavior changed slightly in his presence. The tense readiness it showed toward other animals in the forest seemed to soften when it approached him. Weeks passed in this strange routine. Kofi's secret visits to the forest became the most important part of his day. A quiet escape from the harsh reality of plantation life. In the fields, he was just another enslaved child, forced to work beneath the watchful eyes of overseers. But at the edge of the forest, something different existed, a space where he was not ordered, threatened, or controlled. The panther's presence did not feel like domination or fear. Instead, it felt like a shared understanding between two creatures who both existed outside the rigid rules of the plantation world. One evening, as Kofi approached the familiar clearing, he noticed something unusual. The panther was already there, lying calmly on a fallen tree trunk. When it saw him, it did not rise or retreat. Instead, it simply watched him approach, its eyes steady and alert. Slowly, carefully, Kofi moved closer than he ever had before. The distance between them shrank to only a few steps. For a long moment, the boy and the animal remained still, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the forest. Then the panther lowered its head slightly, blinking slowly as if acknowledging his presence in a way that felt almost like acceptance. In that moment, Kofi realized something profound. The creature no longer saw him as an intruder. Somehow, against all logic and expectation, the wild predator had begun to accept him as part of its world. And deep within the silent forest, far beyond the reach of plantation rule and overseer commands, a bond was beginning to form, one that would eventually grow into the foundation of a story so strange and powerful that people across the region would whisper about it for generations. As the weeks passed after the strange bond between Kofi and the Black Panther began to form, the quiet routine of their encounters slowly deepened into something even more extraordinary. Each evening, as the plantation settled into the dim light of sunset and the overseer returned to their houses, Kofi would find a reason to move toward the forest. Sometimes he carried a bundle of firewood, other times he volunteered for small errands that allowed him to walk near the tree line. To anyone watching, he was simply a quiet boy completing simple tasks. But the moment he stepped close enough to feel the cool air beneath the trees, his entire attention shifted toward the wilderness where the panther often waited. At first, their meetings remained cautious and silent. The panther never rushed toward him, and Kofi never attempted to approach too quickly. There was a natural rhythm forming between them, a silent understanding that trust had to grow slowly. The animal was still a powerful predator, capable of overwhelming him in seconds if it chose to. Yet there was something unusual in the way it behaved around him. When Kofi appeared, the panther often lowered its body into a relaxed position, watching him with calm, alert eyes rather than the tense focus of a hunter preparing to strike. Sometimes it would circle slowly through the clearing before settling down, its movements graceful and controlled, as if testing the space around the boy without any real intention to harm him. For Kofi, these moments in the forest became the only part of his life that felt free from the constant pressure and fear of the plantation. During the long days in the fields, the overseers shouted orders and punished even the smallest mistakes. The sound of the whip cracking through the air was something every enslaved person knew too well. Children were expected to work just as hard as the adults once they reached a certain age, and exhaustion was a constant companion. Yet each evening, when Kofi stepped into the quiet shade of the tree, the oppressive world of the plantation seemed to fade behind him. In the forest, there were no overseers, no shouted commands, and no chains of authority controlling every movement. There were only the sounds of nature and the presence of the panther moving silently beside him. Gradually, the animal began allowing Kofi to come closer than before. At first, the distance between them had been several yards, a clear boundary maintained by instinct. But over time, that boundary slowly shrank. One evening, after placing a piece of meat on the ground, Kofi remained standing only a few steps away instead of backing off immediately. The panther approached cautiously, its head low as it examined the food. When it finished eating, it did not retreat as it usually did. Instead, it simply sat there, its golden eyes studying the boy with quiet curiosity. Kofi felt his heart pounding as he realized how close the animal was now. The panther, its massive paws rested calmly against the forest floor, and its long tail moved slowly back and forth like a shadow gliding across the leaves. For a moment, the boy considered reaching out his hand, but instinct told him that the time was not right. Instead, he simply stood there, breathing slowly and allowing the silence to stretch between them. That moment marked a turning point in their unusual relationship. From that evening onward, the panther seemed to recognize him more clearly each time they met. Sometimes it would appear from deeper within the forest and walk toward him with steady, confident steps. Other times it would already be waiting in the clearing when he arrived, resting beneath the branches of an old oak tree whose roots twisted through the earth like ancient ropes. Kofi began to notice small details about the animal's behavior. The panther moved differently when it was hunting compared to when it approached him. When stalking prey, its body remained low and tense, every muscle prepared to spring forward in a sudden burst of power. But when it approached Kofi, its movements were slower and more relaxed. It would often pause, watching him carefully before coming closer, as if confirming that he was still the same harmless figure it had encountered weeks before. One evening, something happened that surprised Kofi more than anything else had so far. As he placed a piece of food on the ground, The panther stepped forward and stopped only a short distance from him. For a moment it simply stood there, its head tilted slightly as if studying his face. Then, slowly and without warning, it lowered its body and lay down on the ground in front of him. The gesture was subtle, but its meaning was powerful. In the animal world, such behavior often signaled a form of acceptance or trust. Kofi could hardly believe what he was seeing. The creature that most people feared as a deadly predator was now resting calmly, only a few steps away from him. He remained still, afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile connection forming between them. The forest seemed unusually quiet that evening, as if even the birds and insects had paused to witness the strange moment unfolding beneath the trees. As the sun dipped lower behind the forest canopy, Kofi slowly sat down on a fallen log across from the panther. The animal did not react with alarm. Instead, it continued watching him with steady eyes, occasionally blinking in a slow, relaxed manner. Minutes passed in silence. For the first time since their encounters had begun, the boy and the panther simply shared the same space without any visible barrier of fear between them. That quiet evening would become the beginning of a deeper connection between the two unlikely companions. Over the following days, the panther began following Kofi for short distances along the edge of the forest. If he walked toward a particular tree or clearing, the animal sometimes moved behind him at a safe distance, observing his actions with quiet interest. At other times, it would climb onto low branches above him, watching the ground from its elevated position like a silent guardian hidden among the leaves. The forest itself began to feel different to Kofi as well. What once seemed like a dark and mysterious place gradually revealed its hidden paths and rhythms. He learned where small streams flowed through the undergrowth and where thick vines created natural tunnels between trees. He began recognizing the sounds of various animals and birds, understanding which noises signaled danger and which simply marked the normal life of the wilderness. And always, somewhere nearby, the panther moved through the shadows with silent confidence. Yet, despite the peaceful moments they shared, the world of the plantations still existed beyond the forest. The cruelty and control that defined life there had not disappeared. In fact, tensions among the enslaved workers were quietly growing. Punishments had become harsher in recent weeks, and rumors spread about several workers who had attempted to escape but were captured by slave catchers and brought back in chains. Kofi heard these whispers while working in the fields or sitting quietly in the slave quarters at night. He noticed the fear in people as voices, but he also noticed something else, an unspoken hope that somewhere beyond the plantation boundaries, freedom might still exist. One evening, as Kofi sat near the clearing with the panther resting nearby, he heard distant shouting coming from the direction of the plantation. The sound carried faintly through the trees, followed by the crack of a whip echoing across the fields. The boy's body tensed as he listened. The panther lifted its head slightly, its ears twitching at the unfamiliar noise. In that moment, Kofi realized that the peaceful world he had discovered in the forest was deeply connected to the harsh reality he was trying to escape. The wilderness represented more than just safety. It represented possibility. And as the strange friendship between the boy and the panther continued to grow stronger beneath the ancient trees, events were quietly moving toward a turning point that would soon transform their secret meetings into the beginning of a legend whispered far beyond the edges of that lonely plantation. The echo of the whip that drifted through the forest that evening stayed with Kofi long after the sound had faded into the thick Louisiana air. As he sat on the fallen log with the black panther resting a short distance away, he felt a heavy knot forming inside his chest. The plantation world and the forest world felt like two completely different realities, yet they existed side by side. In the fields, suffering and control ruled every moment of life. In the forest, silence and freedom moved through the trees like a quiet promise. Kofi had begun to understand that the wilderness surrounding the plantation was more than just land avoided by slave masters. It was a space untouched by their authority, a place where the rules of the plantation did not apply. The panther seemed to sense the shift in Kofi's mood that evening. The animal slowly rose from the ground and stretched its long body, its muscles moving smoothly beneath its dark fur. For a moment it looked toward the direction of the plantation, its ears turning toward the faint echoes of distant voices. Then it turned back toward Kofi and walked calmly past him, brushing through tall grass before disappearing deeper into the forest. Kofi remained seated for a long time, listening to the forest breathe around him. That night, as he returned quietly to the slave quarters, the idea of the forest as a refuge began to grow stronger in his mind. Life on the plantation had always felt like an endless cycle. Each day followed the same pattern of forced labor, punishment, and exhaustion. But the forest held something different. It held space, distance, and the possibility of escape. In the weeks that followed, Kofi's visits to the forest continued, but something subtle began to change. Instead of remaining only near the edge of the trees, he started walking deeper along narrow paths that twisted through the swampy ground. The panther often appeared beside him during these quiet explorations, sometimes walking several yards ahead, sometimes watching from tree branches above. Kofi quickly learned that the animal seemed to know the forest better than any human ever could. When it moved through the trees, it followed paths that were almost invisible to the eye, routes that avoided thick mud, hidden pools of water, and tangled vines that could easily trap someone unfamiliar with the land. The deeper Kofi walked, the more he realized that the forest was not empty. It was full of life, movement, and hidden spaces that the plantation owners had never truly explored. One afternoon, after following the panther along a winding trail beside a narrow stream, Kofi discovered something that surprised him. Hidden among a cluster of tall cypress trees was a small dry patch of land surrounded by thick vegetation. The ground there was firm, protected from flooding by natural ridges of earth and roots. The area was difficult to see from a distance because hanging moss and thick bushes created a natural curtain around it. Yet once inside, the space felt calm and protected. Sunlight filtered gently through the leaves, creating patches of warm light across the ground. The panther moved comfortably through the clearing, as though it had visited the place many times before. Kofi realized that such hidden spaces could easily shelter people who knew how to find them. From that moment on, the forest began to reveal more of its secrets to him. There were small islands of dry land hidden within the swamp, place where someone could rest or hide without being easily discovered. There were winding creeks that carried water quietly through the trees, offering a constant source of drinking water. There were fruit trees, edible plants, and small animals that could provide food for anyone who understood how to survive in the wild. The panther's presence made these explorations feel less dangerous than they might have been otherwise. Its sharp senses often alerted Kofi to sounds or movements long before he noticed them himself. Sometimes the animal would suddenly pause and stare into the distance, warning him of approaching wildlife or unfamiliar noises. Other times it would climb silently into a tree, observing the forest from above while Kofi moved cautiously along the ground. Meanwhile, life on the plantation continued to grow harsher. The overseers had become increasingly suspicious about small signs of resistance among the enslaved workers. Tools had gone missing, crops had been damaged in unusual ways, and rumor spread that someone had been leaving food near the forest edge. Punishments became more frequent as the overseers attempted to reassert control through fear. Kofi kept his secret carefully hidden, knowing that if anyone discovered his connection to the forest or worse, the panther, the consequences could be severe. Yet, even as the danger increased, whispers began circulating quietly among the enslaved workers. People had started noticing small signs that something unusual was happening beyond the plantation fields. Occasionally, someone claimed to see shadows moving at the forest's edge late at night. A few workers swore they had heard the distant growl of a large animal moving through the swamp. Others believed they had seen footprints near the water that did not belong to any creature they recognized. These rumors slowly grew into stories, and the stories spread from person to person in hushed voices. Some believed the forest itself was protecting those who dared to escape. Others believed spirits guarded the land beyond the plantation. But among the enslaved children who spent time working near the tree line, a different idea began to form. They had seen Kofi disappear into the woods many evenings and return unharmed. They noticed the calm confidence with which he walked near the forest while others kept their distance. Though no one spoke openly about it, A quiet understanding began to grow that Kofi might know something about the wilderness that the overseers did not. One evening, while Kofi sat near the familiar clearing with the panther resting nearby, he heard a soft rustling coming from the bushes behind him. His body tensed immediately. Slowly turning his head, he saw the frightened face of a young enslaved boy from the plantation peering through the leaves. The boy had followed him. For a moment neither of them spoke. The child, his eyes widened as he noticed the black panther lying calmly a short distance away. Fear flashed across his face, and he nearly cried out before Kofi quickly raised his hand, signaling him to remain quiet. Surprisingly, the panther did not react aggressively to the boy's presence. It lifted its head briefly, studying the newcomer, then lowered it again, as if satisfied that no threat existed. Kofi slowly approached the boy and guided him away from the clearing. The child's voice trembled as he whispered that he had heard stories about a shadow in the forest and wanted to see if they were true. Kofi realized in that moment that the secret he had been keeping might not remain hidden forever. The forest was beginning to attract attention, and with attention came danger but also opportunity. Because beyond the plantation, as boundaries, the vast swamp and forest stretched for miles, filled with hidden paths that only someone like Kofi, and perhaps the silent panther beside him, could truly understand. In the quiet darkness beneath the towering trees, the wilderness was slowly becoming more than just a secret refuge. It was becoming a sanctuary, a place where hope could survive beyond the reach of those who believed they controlled everything. And as more whispers spread among the enslaved people about the mysterious safety hidden in the swamp, the legend that would one day echo across the region had quietly begun to take shape. The moment the young boy followed Kofi into the forest changed everything, even though at first it seemed like only a small and quiet accident. After Kofi guided the frightened child safely back toward the plantation edge that evening, he returned alone to the clearing where the black panther still rested calmly beneath the tall trees. The animal watched him with steady golden eyes, as if sensing that something important had shifted. Kofi sat down slowly on the familiar fallen log, his mind racing with thoughts. Until that day, the secret of the forest had belonged only to him and the silent creature beside him. But now another person knew that something existed beyond the fields, and if one curious child had managed to follow him, others might do the same. The plantation had always been a place filled with watchful eyes and desperate hope. People were constantly searching for signs of escape, for whispers of a hidden path, for any small chance that freedom might exist somewhere beyond the endless rows of crops. The forest had always been there, dark and mysterious, but fear had kept most people away from it. Now that fear was beginning to weaken. Kofi could feel it in the quiet glances people gave the tree line during long hours in the fields. He could hear it in the whispers that drifted through the slave quarters at night. Stories about strange movements near the swamp and shadows among the trees were spreading. Some believed spirits guarded the forest. Others believed dangerous animals protected it. But slowly, another idea began to grow among a few of the enslaved workers: the belief that the wilderness might actually offer safety rather than death. Kofi continued visiting the forest each evening, but he moved more carefully now. The panther remained his silent companion during these visits, often appearing beside him as if it had been waiting in the shadows the entire time. Their strange bond had grown stronger over the past month. The animal no longer kept as much distance as it once had. Sometimes it walked only a few feet away from him, its powerful body moving with effortless grace through the undergrowth. Occasionally it even brushed past him as it moved along narrow trails, its dark fur almost blending completely with the shadows. Kofi had begun speaking softly to the panther during their time together, though. He knew the animal did not understand human words in the way people did. Still, there was something comforting about the sound of his voice, echoing quietly through the forest while the creature listened. It was as if the two of them existed in a silent partnership, each aware that the other belonged to this hidden world beyond the plantation's reach. One evening, several days after the curious child had followed him, Kofi arrived at the clearing to find the panther already perched on a low tree branch above the ground. The animal's tail swayed slowly as it watched him approach. But before Kofi could settle into his usual place, he heard another sound coming from deeper within the forest. It was the careful movement of human footsteps. Instantly his body tensed. The panther, its ears lifted sharply as it turned its head toward the noise. A moment later, Two figures slowly emerged from the trees: an older enslaved man named Samuel and a young woman named Lila who worked in the plantation kitchen. Both looked exhausted and frightened, their clothes torn by branches and their faces pale with worry. When they saw Kofi standing there, relief washed across their expression. Samuel explained in a whisper that they had heard rumors about safe places hidden in the swamp and had followed the faint trails near the tree line, hoping to find shelter before slave catchers began searching for them. Kofi understood immediately what had happened. They had run away. Escaping from a plantation was one of the most dangerous choices an enslaved person could make. Slave patrols, hunting dogs, and armed trackers were often sent after anyone who attempted to flee. Yet, the desperation that drove people to escape was stronger than fear. Samuel and Layla had reached the forest with no real plan, only the hope that the wilderness might hide them long enough to survive. As they stepped closer into the clearing, their eyes suddenly widened in shock. The Black Panther had dropped silently from the tree branch and now stood several yards away, watching them with intense focus. Layla gasped softly, and Samuel instinctively moved in front of her. But Kofi raised his hand gently, signaling them not to panic. The panther remained calm, its posture alert but not aggressive. It had seen humans with Kofi before, yet this was the first time strangers had entered its territory while he was present. The animal studied them carefully, then slowly turned its head toward Kofi as if waiting for his reaction. In that moment, Kofi realized how extraordinary the situation had become. Somehow the presence of the panther had transformed the forest into something far more powerful than a simple hiding place. To anyone searching the swamp, the idea that a large predator roamed the area would create fear and hesitation. Slave catchers might avoid certain paths or refuse to travel too deeply into the wilderness if they believed a dangerous animal guarded the land. The panther itself had unknowingly become part of the forest as protection. Samuel and Leela remained in the clearing that night while Kofi showed them the hidden dry ground he had discovered earlier near the cypress trees. The area was sheltered by thick vegetation, making it nearly invisible from the outside. A small stream nearby provided water, and fruit trees grew within walking distance. It was not perfect safety, but it offered something rare for people who had spent their lives under constant control. It offered a chance to hide and breathe freely. Over the following days, Kofi began guiding them quietly through the forest paths he had learned while exploring with the panther. Samuel proved strong and determined despite his age, while Lila carefully gathered edible plants and berries that grew naturally in the swamp. Together they started building a small hidden shelter using fallen branches and large leaves. The panther often watched these activities from nearby trees, occasionally disappearing into the forest for hours before returning silently to the clearing. Its presence continued to create an invisible boundary around the area, a warning to other animals and perhaps even to humans who might wander too close. Meanwhile, back on the plantation, tension was rising rapidly. The disappearance of Samuel and Lila had not gone unnoticed. Overseers were questioning workers, searching the fields, and organizing patrols to explore the nearby swamp. Hunting dogs were brought in from neighboring plantations, and armed men began riding along the forest edges looking for signs of escape routes. Yet the swamp was vast and confusing to those unfamiliar with it. Thick mud swallowed footprints quickly, and tangled vines made travel slow and difficult. Every time a patrol entered the forest, strange animal tracks appeared nearby, large paw prints that seemed to belong to a powerful predator moving through the same territory. Fear began spreading among the searchers. Some claimed they heard deep growls in the darkness or saw shadows moving through the trees at night. Gradually, the patrols started venturing less deeply into the swamp. The legend of a dangerous creature guarding the forest was quietly beginning to take shape. And in the heart of that wilderness, a small hidden sanctuary was forming, one built not only from trees and shadows, but from the courage of those who dared to believe the forest could protect them. Kofi, the silent boy who had once simply watched the tree line from the plantation fields, had unknowingly become the guide to a secret world where hope could grow. And beside him, the Black Panther moved through the shadows like a living guardian, unaware that its presence was helping ignite a story that would soon spread far beyond the boundaries of that lonely plantation. The hidden clearing in the swamp slowly began to transform from a temporary refuge into something far more meaningful. In the beginning, Samuel and Layla had believed they would remain there only a few nights before continuing deeper into the wilderness in search of distant towns or communities rumored to shelter escaped, enslaved people. But the deeper they explored the surrounding forest with Kofi as guidance, the more they realized that the swamp itself could serve as a powerful shield. The land was difficult for outsiders to navigate, filled with twisting creeks, hidden pools of mud, thick clusters of cypress trees, and hanging curtains of moss that blocked visibility. To someone unfamiliar with the terrain, the forest looked almost identical in every direction. But to Kofi, who had spent months quietly observing and walking its narrow trails alongside the Black Panther, the wilderness had become a living map of hidden paths and safe spaces. Each day the small group worked quietly to strengthen their shelter. Samuel used fallen branches and large pieces of bark to build a stronger structure beneath the thick vegetation. Lila gathered edible plants, berries, and roots she recognized from her childhood knowledge of the land. Kofi explored nearby areas to locate additional water sources and fruit trees. And throughout all of this activity, the Black Panther moved silently around them like a shadow belonging to the forest itself. The animal never interfered with their work, yet it remained close enough that its presence was constantly felt. Sometimes it lay across a fallen tree trunk, watching them with calm eyes. Other times it disappeared for hours, returning later with the quiet confidence of a creature that ruled the wilderness around them. Gradually, Samuel and Lila grew less afraid of the panther. At first they had avoided looking directly at it, fearing that even the smallest mistake might trigger the predator's instincts. But as days passed without any sign of aggression, they began to understand what Kofi had discovered long before them. The animal did not see them as prey. Instead, it seemed to treat them the same way it treated Kofi, with watchful curiosity and cautious tolerance. Meanwhile, the plantation they had escaped from was becoming increasingly restless. The disappearance of Samuel and Layla had created embarrassment and anger among the overseer, who feared punishment from the plantation owner if the escapees were not found. Patrols continued searching the swamp, but each attempt grew shorter and less confident than the last. The men sent into the forest returned with stories of strange tracks and eerie sounds that echoed through the trees after sunset. Some swore they had glimpsed a massive dark animal moving through the shadows just beyond their lantern light. Others claimed they heard deep growls somewhere in the distance whenever they ventured too far into the swamp. Word began spreading among nearby plantations that a dangerous predator had claimed part of the forest as its territory. Slave catchers, who normally hunted escapees with relentless determination, grew hesitant about venturing too deeply into the area. This growing fear gave Kofi and his small group something incredibly valuable: time. Days passed, then weeks. During that time, something unexpected began to happen. Another escaped enslaved man appeared near the clearing one night, exhausted and covered in mud. After wandering through the swamp for 2 days, he had heard whispers among workers that the forest held a hidden refuge protected by something powerful. When he finally stumbled into the clearing and saw the Black Panther watching from the shadows, terror froze him in place. But Kofi stepped forward calmly, just as he had done when Samuel and Lila first arrived, and reassured him that he was safe. Soon after that, a young woman arrived in a similar way, having followed faint signs left by those who had passed before her. The forest sanctuary was growing, though no one had planned it. The clearing and surrounding trails were slowly becoming a secret network of hiding places for people desperate to escape the brutal conditions of plantation life. Kofi found himself guiding newcomers along hidden routes through the swamp, teaching them how to move quietly and avoid the muddy traps that could slow them down. Samuel helped build additional shelters deeper within the forest, spreading the small group across several hidden locations to reduce the chance of discovery. Lila organized food gathering, ensuring that everyone contributed to finding edible plants, fish from the creeks, or small animals that could be trapped quietly. The Black Panther remained a constant presence throughout these changes. It never behaved like a trained animal, yet it seemed strangely comfortable around the growing group of humans who now occupied part of its territory. Sometimes it would walk slowly along the edge of the camp areas, its glowing eyes visible between the trees before it vanished again into the darkness. Other times it climbed high branches where it could observe everything below with silent patience. For the escaped people hiding in the swamp, the panther became more than just a wild animal. It became a symbol. Many believed its presence was a sign that the forest itself was protecting them. Stories began forming around it, stories of a guardian creature that appeared whenever danger approached. And in truth, there were moments when the panther's instincts seemed to offer real protection. One night, as several members of the hidden group slept near a small fire carefully shielded by rocks, the panther suddenly appeared at the edge of the clearing, its body tense and its ears alert. It let out a low growl that instantly woke Kofi. He listened carefully, and soon heard something the others had not yet noticed: distant voices and the faint clinking of metal equipment moving through the forest. A search patrol was approaching. Thanks to the panther's warning, the group quickly scattered into the surrounding vegetation, extinguishing the fire and hiding along narrow trails that led away from the clearing. Minutes later, several armed men stepped into the empty camp area, their lanterns casting long shadows across the ground. They searched briefly, confused by signs that people had been there but were now gone. Then one of them noticed large paw prints near the edge of the clearing. The lantern light revealed the unmistakable tracks of a massive predator. Nervous murmurs spread through the patrol. A deep growl echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. Whether it was truly the panther or simply the wind moving through the swamp was impossible to say. But the effect was immediate. The searchers quickly retreated, unwilling to risk a confrontation with a powerful animal in unfamiliar territory. Hidden among the trees, Kofi and the others watched silently until the lantern lights disappeared into the darkness. That night confirmed what many of them had already begun to believe. The forest sanctuary was protected not only by its confusing terrain, but also by the legend of the Black Panther that now haunted the imaginations of those who hunted escapees. As the months continued to pass, the small hidden community grew stronger and more organized. More escaped people found their way into the swamp, guided by whispered directions and faint signs left along the edges of the plantation lands. Some stayed temporarily before continuing north toward distant freedom routes. Others remained in the forest, building new shelters and helping protect the hidden network that had formed there. And through it all, the Black Panther moved silently through the shadows of the swamp, its presence weaving together fear, mystery, and protection in a way no one could have predicted. What had begun as a quiet meeting between a lonely boy and a wild creature was slowly becoming something much greater, a living legend growing in the heart of the forest, one that would soon shake the confidence of the slave masters who believed they controlled everything around them. As the hidden community in the swamp continued to grow, so did the sophistication of their strategies for survival and resistance. What had started as a few fugitives hiding among the dense cypress trees had evolved into a small but remarkably organized network, guided by the experience of Kofi, Samuel, and Leela. Kofi, now fully recognized as a leader and protector, spent his days patrolling the perimeter of their concealed territory, observing patterns in the movements of nearby patrols and teaching newcomers how to move silently through the swamp without leaving telltale signs. Every plant, branch, and muddy footprint was a potential trap or escape route, and Kofi's knowledge of the land became invaluable. Samuel, once overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion, found purpose in constructing not just shelters but also a system of hidden pathways, underground depressions, and camouflaged storage areas for food and supplies. Each path he created was designed to confuse outsiders while allowing those who knew the terrain to move freely and communicate secretly. Layla, meanwhile, focused on nourishment and medical care, identifying edible roots, medicinal plants, and herbs that could heal wounds, treat fevers, or alleviate stress. Her knowledge of natural remedies became critical as injuries and illnesses occasionally arose. Among the group, particularly in the humid, mosquito-infested environment of the swamp, the Black Panther, once a creature of mere curiosity and awe, had fully integrated into the rhythm of the community. It was no longer just a silent observer or occasional guardian. It became an active deterrent against anyone foolish enough to venture too close. Though wild and untamed, it seemed to understand the stakes, often positioning itself strategically along trails or creek crossings where outsiders might attempt an incursion. The stories of the panther's attacks and terrifying growls began to circulate among the nearby plantation. Rumors spread that a monstrous, supernatural beast roamed the swamp, and even the most hardened slave hunters hesitated to venture deeply into the forest. This fear became an unintentional ally, providing the hidden group with an additional layer of protection. As weeks turned into months, the swamp began to resemble a shadow society, a place where the enslaved could reclaim fragments of freedom, strategize, and even plan acts of resistance. Kofi initiated nightly meetings where escapees shared news from plantations, discussed opportunities for assisting those still trapped, and coordinated small raids to acquire supplies from areas where oversight was lax. Samuel expanded the shelters into semi-permanent structures, incorporating elevated platforms to avoid flooding and hidden compartments to store tools, weapons, and provisions. Leela trained others in basic medical care, ensuring that knowledge of healing was not centralized but distributed among multiple members to prevent vulnerability. Among the newcomers arriving, there were individuals with unique skills: a former carpenter capable of crafting small but sturdy tools, a young man who had been a musician and could use rhythms and signals to communicate without words, and an older woman who had spent her life navigating complex river systems and could guide canoes quietly through hidden channels. Each brought expertise that enhanced the resilience of the group, reinforcing the idea that survival depended on collaboration and intelligence. The network, as growth, did not go unnoticed by the outside world. Plantation owners, frustrated by repeated failures to recapture their escapees, began offering larger rewards and employing more aggressive search parties. Some even enlisted the aid of trackers from distant regions, men who claimed to possess unmatched skill in navigating swamps and forests. Yet every effort seemed to fail. Whenever search parties approached, the Black Panther appeared at the right moment to dissuade them, and the hidden paths created by Samuel ensured that escapees could vanish into the dense foliage before being detected. Psychological warfare became as important as physical defense. The rumors of a guardian beast, the whispered stories of swift escapes, and the enigmatic signs left by Kofi as group created a pervasive sense of dread. Plantation owners began to question their own understanding of the terrain, and tales of the swamp as impenetrable. Nature spread among the workers, planting fear that further discouraged cooperation with hunters. Within the hidden society, morale remained high. People shared stories of loved ones who had escaped, celebrated birthdays quietly among the trees, and honored traditions that had been suppressed on plantation. Music, whispered chants, and silent nods of solidarity created a sense of community that transcended the terror outside. Even in moments of scarcity, the group learned to innovate. Rainwater was collected in hollowed logs, fish traps were submerged in hidden pools, and small cultivated patches of tubers and herbs were grown in concealed areas. The swamp had become not just a hiding place, but a living, breathing ecosystem carefully managed by its human inhabitants. The Black Panther remained central to this ecosystem. Its mere presence was enough to deter many potential intruders, but it also provided a sense of psychological security to those within. Children and newcomers, once terrified by its imposing fear, learned to coexist with it, understanding that it represented both power and protection. Over time, the group developed a rudimentary communication system based on sound and gesture. A series of whistles, hand signals, and tree markings allowed them to coordinate movement, alert others of danger, and even planned strategic raids to free those still enslaved. It was a silent code, almost invisible to outsiders, that made the community increasingly self-reliant and resilient. Kofi, Samuel, and Lila also recognized the importance of legacy. They began mentoring younger escapees in both survival and strategy, ensuring that knowledge was passed down. Skills like foraging, map-making, stealth navigation, and the care of the panther became part of the collective training. Each member became a guardian of the forest, capable of defending themselves and others, preserving both lives and freedom. The outside world, however, remained a persistent threat. As the community grew, rumors reached the ears of those in authority, leading to renewed efforts to suppress what they did not understand. Plantation owners sent spies disguised as escaped individuals, hoping to learn the layout of the swamp or to turn escapees against one another. But the swamp, its intricate geography, and the panther, as silent vigilance made deception nearly impossible. Whenever an intruder attempted betrayal, the forest seemed to swallow them. Either they got lost, encountered the Black Panther, or stumbled upon one of the hidden traps, carefully placed along less-used trails. Each incident reinforced the mythos surrounding the swamp. Over time, the story of the Black Panther and the brave escapees became legendary, whispered among those still enslaved as a symbol of hope and resistance. Samuel, Layla, Kofi, and the others realized that their survival depended not just on physical strength or cleverness, but on the cultivation of fear in those who would do them harm, and on the nurturing of trust and cooperation among themselves. The swamp had become both a shield and a classroom, teaching the lesson of strategy, courage, and unity in the face of unrelenting oppression. It was no longer merely a place to hide, it was a statement, a living testament to resilience, and a precursor to the broader resistance that would inspire many in the years to come. And yet, even as they strengthened their defenses, the group knew that the struggle was far from over. Every day brought the potential for discovery, for betrayal, or for confrontation with the forces that sought to crush their freedom. But through vigilance, intelligence, and the unwavering presence of the Black Panther, they continued to survive. And in surviving, they began to shape a legend that would echo far beyond the swamp itself. The final phase of the swamp saga began quietly, almost imperceptibly. As the fugitives' network grew bolder and more coordinated, Kofi, Samuel, Leela, and the others understood that survival was no longer enough. They needed to take decisive action to free as many enslaved people as possible and ensure that the horrors of bondage could no longer dictate their lives. Months of careful observation, meticulous planning, and incremental acts of defiance had prepared them for what would become their greatest and most dangerous operation yet. Word of the hidden community had traveled quietly from plantation to plantation, carried by those brave enough to escape and whisper of hope into the ears of others still in chains. These whispers, combined with rumors of the Black Panther, inspired those living in fear to entertain the impossible idea that liberation was within reach. Each message that reached the swamp, as defenders, was received with intense scrutiny. Intelligence gathering became as crucial as survival skills. Kofi organized nightly councils where every piece of information was assessed, every rumor verified, and every potential risk evaluated. They mapped plantation routines, noting guards, patrol schedules, supply transport routes, and weak points. Insecurity, often relying on the escaped slaves, intimate knowledge of their former overseers. Meanwhile, Samuel refined the network of hidden paths and shelters, creating secret crossing over rivers, underground caches for provisions, and false trails to mislead anyone who might follow them. These paths allowed escapees to move swiftly between plantations and the swamp, without leaving traces, ensuring that momentum would not be lost when the operation began. Layla's role expanded beyond medical care. She became the spiritual and psychological anchor for the group, providing reassurance and fostering resilience in moments of doubt. Her guidance helped maintain discipline, focus, and unity as the knowledge of their plan. Stakes weighed heavily on every participant. The Black Panther, now fully integrated into the daily life of the hidden community, became the silent sentinel for their upcoming rebellion. It was strategically positioned to patrol perimeters, guard escape routes, and silently observe any unexpected intrusions. Its presence was not merely protective but symbolic, the embodiment of the strength and defiance that the fugitives themselves would soon demonstrate. As the night of the first coordinated operation arrived, tension hung in the swamp like thick fog. The team moved silently through pre-established routes, their bodies blending into the shadows. They carried tools, ropes, and simple weapons, but their true power lay in strategy, coordination, and the element of surprise. Signals were passed in whispers and subtle gestures, indicating when to move, when to wait, and when to strike. The first target was a plantation notorious for its brutal overseer and harsh punishments. Escapees who had scouted the site confirmed the location of guards and the layout of slave quarters. Kofi led a small team into position, while Samuel coordinated the safe route back to the swamp. Layla remained behind at a hidden vantage point to tend to any injuries and maintain communication with other operatives spread across nearby areas. When the moment came, the fugitives acted swiftly and decisively. They moved like shadows, unlocking doors leading terrified but hopeful slaves toward the concealed paths and avoiding confrontation whenever possible. Yet, resistance was inevitable. The overseer confronted them with a small contingent of armed men, and a struggle ensued. The Black Panther, having anticipated potential danger, emerged silently, its presence striking terror into the hearts of the oppressors. Chaos erupted as the plantation guards retreated in fear, leaving the path clear for the escapees to retreat to safety. Word of this successful liberation spread rapidly, carried on the wind by those who had witnessed it or heard the rumors. Other enslaved people, emboldened by the news, attempted their own escapes, guided by signs the swamp network had carefully established. The fugitives now faced the complex challenge of coordinating multiple simultaneous rescues. Kofi divided the teams into smaller units, each responsible for a particular plantation or area. Samuel reinforced the paths with new camouflaging techniques and established temporary rest points where escapees could recuperate before continuing deeper into the swamp. Lila trained additional medics to handle injuries, illness, or panic, understanding that the human toll of such operations could otherwise compromise success. Over the following weeks, the operations intensified. 14 plantations were targeted in what became a coordinated wave of liberation. Each time, the Black Panther served as both guardian and psychological weapon. Its terrifying growls and sudden appearances ensuring that resistance from overseers was minimal. Escapees, inspired by the courage of those who had led previous operations, moved with determination, hope, often carrying messages, provisions, and instructions to others who were still trapped in bondage. The hidden community became a hub of freedom and rebellion, with word spreading even beyond the immediate region. Tales of the Black Panther and the strategic intelligence of the swamp fugitive began to circulate in whispered conversations in markets, taverns, and homes. Plantation owners grew increasingly fearful, sending out larger patrols and even offering bounties for information. Yet they remained unsuccessful. Each failed attempt only heightened the mythos surrounding the swamp and its guardians. Amid the liberation efforts, the fugitives also faced internal challenges: fear, exhaustion, and the psychological trauma of witnessing suffering and death weighed heavily. Yet, through shared rituals, songs, and silent ceremonies, they maintained morale and reinforced their unity. Kofi's leadership, Samuel's ingenuity, and Lila's compassion created a sense of purpose that transcended immediate danger. They reminded each other that every person freed, every oppressive overseer outwitted, and every plantation infiltrated was a victory not just for themselves, but for the countless others still in chains. By the time the wave of liberations concluded, 28 enslaved people had successfully escaped and found refuge in the swamp under the protection of the hidden network. 14 cruel masters had been neutralized not necessarily through fatal force, but through intimidation, confusion, and the strategic placement of threats, including the ever-present Black Panther. The swamp had become a sanctuary, a symbol of defiance, and a practical embodiment of the power of coordination, intelligence, and courage. The network's influence extended far beyond physical liberation. It demonstrated that strategy, unity, and resilience could overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Stories of the Black Panther and the cunning of Kofi, Samuel, Lila, and their allies became legendary, whispered across plantations, and serving as a source of inspiration for future generations. In the end, the swamp was more than just a hiding place. It was the epicenter of a revolution in miniature, a testament to human ingenuity, bravery, and the unbreakable will to claim freedom against all odds. The intelligence, planning, and bravery displayed during these months became the foundation for a legacy that would ripple through history, even as those in power sought to erase evidence of these events. And so, the story of the enslaved black boy who trained a Black Panther, of the fugitives who used the swamp as their fortress, and of the 38 individuals who escaped bondage, became not just a tale of survival, but a narrative of hope, resistance, and the power of courage to change the course of countless lives. It was a story that demanded to be remembered, celebrated, and shared. At this moment, the group gathered once more beneath the dense canopy, the Black Panther lying silently beside them, a symbol of their triumph. They looked to the future, aware that freedom required vigilance, strategy, and unity. Their legend was now permanent, not just in the swamp, but in the collective memory of those who longed for liberation. The final message was clear: no system, however brutal, could extinguish the human spirit where intelligence, courage, and determination joined forces.